Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC Playoffs Weekend number 2 overview and analysis video. We are really getting into the thick of things. Not only are we going to know the final 4 teams left in the LEC by the end of this video, the best of 3 stage will officially be over, and trust me, there is a lot to learn from the series that we're going over today. We are going over the final vestiges, as I said, of the best of 3 stage, but we're also going to be jumping in to the best of 5 stage. We got our winners finals this weekend as well, and so the format's going to be a tad bit different. Of course, we will still be going over the best of 3s in one kind of segment, you know, just as a whole, but the best of 5 will be done traditionally as best of 5s are done on this channel, which means that I'm going to go over them game by game. So strap in. This is going to be a pretty fun video. Hopefully you guys are excited. I know I am. If you want to know my thoughts on everything that's happened in the LEC up until this point, check out the playlist up on the iCard right now. Of course, up there is going to be every single week of the LEC Summer Split, you know, done in a similar format to this video. I've talked about every single week of the regular season and, of course, the first weekend of playoff games. So if you're interested in my thoughts and opinions, check that out. But today is going to be covering the second weekend. So without further ado, let's get into it. As I said earlier, we are going to be going series by series for the first couple series of the video, the first 4, you know, best of 3s, the rest of the best of 3 stage, the lower bracket, you know, however you want to call it. There are a lot of things to, you know, label it as. We're going to be going over all of those in a series by series manner, but once we get to the winners finals, we're going to go game by game in that manner. Of course, we will also be showing you the bracket at the end of the video to kind of, you know, give you an idea of where all these teams are landing after these series to just kind of visualize it a bit better, but there will be the final 4 teams here today, and of course, with the season finals approaching, we might have a clearer idea of who ends up getting those season finals spots by the end of this video as well. So without further ado, let's jump right into the analysis, and that means starting off with our losers round number 1. We're technically still in round number 1 in the lower bracket. These are the teams that did end up losing in round number 1 that couldn't quite get past the top 4 seeds, and that kicks off with the matchup between the 6th-seeded team Heretics and the 7th-seeded GIANTX, and GX is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. It seems that floor is higher than ceiling in this case. That's kind of the way I've been describing these two teams over the course of this split, is that GX, especially out of all of these teams that are in this cluster of like Heretics and Mad Lions and maybe even Corp to like a smaller extent, like GX might have the highest floor of any of those teams because they are pretty, you know, macro heavy. They do have a really good understanding of how to end and win games. The problem for them is just the fact that they really aren't ridiculously talented. They rely so much on Jackies and at times Antonio to be able to step up and, you know, get them in good positions, but they're really good at being able to execute from those good positions, and especially when you're going into a rather inconsistent team that is really bad at team fighting like Heretics, then all of a sudden these games actually become super winnable, and that's exactly what happened here. Heretics might have the better roster on paper, and quite frankly, they might even have the better laners and the better early game potential, but none of that matters because they just can't play the late games out. They're not cohesive. They don't have a good sense of how they want to play games, and so they end up dropping here, and this is, unfortunately for them, the end of the year for them. I know it felt for a lot of this split, you know, and for a lot of this year, like they were a lock for season finals just because of the consistency of them making the top, you know, 6 across basically most of the year. It felt like they were locked in for a top 6 spot in terms of championship points, but GX, with this win, actually leapfrogs them into that number 6 spot, and that means Heretics is eliminated from the season finals. They will not have a chance to go to Worlds, and for a roster that on paper should have been a top 2 or top 3 team, I had them at number 2 in my power rankings at the beginning of the year, for that roster to not even make the season finals at all, let alone, you know, get 7th, 8th in the summer split, like, it's a massive disappointment. Everything went wrong for this team. They just never really figured out how to have any sort of consistency, and they deserve the negative press that they are going to get from this. I'm not going to blame the org, because I think the org did a good job of trying to establish the right talent, which is something that I, of course, disagree with LEC fans on, because it's always blame the org and never blame the player, but I think the players definitely deserve a lot of the negative criticism that they are going to get from a series like this. So let's talk about it. You know, for GX, what did they do right? Well, Jackies. I mean, it really is that simple. He's player of the series here. This guy's ridiculous. Like, he is entirely cracked. He's a top 3 mid laner in the LEC right now, and it's really fun to watch. I never expected this in a million years in the summer split, because he did have good moments in winter and in spring. Like, there were flashes of like, oh, you know, this is what they saw in Jackies. This is why they pulled him out of what is essentially like a tier 3 region and brought him immediately into the LEC. And, you know, it was always going to be a bit of a growing process, but that growing process has happened a lot faster than I think anyone was anticipating. He has been exceptional. The player that I've said that he reminds me the most of is like a 2021 VTO, where he gets brought up to Misfits and just immediately becomes the guy and is an MVP candidate for a couple of years. Of course, modern VTO doesn't necessarily have that same reputation just because things haven't worked out for him quite as much since leaving Misfits, but Jackie's, you know, is on that trajectory right now of somebody who could theoretically win an MVP as soon as next year, which is genuinely insane for what the expectations were for him at the beginning of the year. Just completely gapped Zviru on the other side of this matchup. Antonio's the other player that I've been praising. He was not great in this series, and quite frankly, he has not been great in the playoffs. It is a bit concerning that when these games get a little bit brighter, he has not been ideal. He definitely had his own problems here, just some really bad positioning, some really bad, like, mental errors coming in from him. Just not really all that exciting in terms of the gameplay, but Patrick and Ignar, I thought, had a good series. Patrick, in particular, does really well at being able to play from, you know, an advantage state. I say that he's the Teddy of the LEC, and I think that that continues to carry over. They're very similar players. Juhan, I think, is generally fine for the role that he offers. The Morgana in game number 3, I think, is actually a really, really good idea in the current meta, and I'm surprised that this hasn't been picked up more. I know I'm a bit of a Morgana jungle player myself, but I am a bit surprised that, you know, teams aren't going to this as more of a consistent option against things like Brand. That spell shield is just super valuable. So, you know, it was interesting to see Juhan really have it work here, especially in Divide, who you just shut down in the engage on. So, good stuff from GX. I would say that the crazy draft in game number 3 ended up working, and your players individually are just, you know, they're talented enough. Jackie's is certainly good enough to be able to carry a team to a playoff victory, as we just saw. But for Team Heretics on the other side, it's just a disaster. Like, getting 7th, 8th here, missing out on the season finals, there's just no way to justify that. I do want to, again, jump on this train. I had this same conversation and this same argument when talking about Mad Lions, or talking about Rogue, or, you know, BDS 2 years ago, or insert whatever team ends up getting last place in any particular split. We need to, as a community, stop just completely jumping on orgs as if it's entirely their fault. Team Heretics as an organization, I thought, did a great thing in the offseason, and that's be an org that's kind of new to the LEC, that doesn't have a ton of brand recognition, and bring in a ton of players that should theoretically have gotten them across the finish line. Yankos obviously was still here. They brought in Flackid, you know, last year into their academy system, promoted him. He was good. But, you know, bringing in Wunder and bringing in Perks, like, this should have made the team better. It didn't, and so they adapted in the middle of the split. You know, they moved on from Kaiser to go get Trimby, who, you know, was one of the best supports in the LEC basically since he started playing in the LEC. Zviru was looked at as a potential upgrade, and the community was clamoring over and over again for years to bring him up to the LEC. People were complaining that he was never in the LEC. This org has done nothing but try to win, and so for me to sit here and say, like, oh, this org should, you know, oh, they got 4th place with Mursa last year, and now they're, you know, 7th, 8th place with Yankos and Flackid, this org is awful. It's just such a backwards way of thinking. I think it's such a horrible way to look at the situation in general, and quite frankly, it's a bit ignorant, in my opinion, and so I'm not going to blame the org. I think the org did its absolute best. The players just didn't perform well enough. They never got on the same page. They never really figured out a playstyle they wanted to go to, and quite frankly, their team fighting is horrendous. There's no other way to look at it. Trimby's going to get done of the series. You know, classic Trimby Alistair game in Game 3, where he just completely throws all of the advantages his team is able to generate away. It is really disappointing, and quite frankly, Trimby was a downgrade to this team. If there is one move to complain about, it's replacing Kaiser at all. I think having Kaiser on this team would have been infinitely better for them moving forward, because he was really good in Winter, arguably the best player on this team. It was really a shock at the time, and I think that in hindsight, it looks really bad to have brought Trimby on, even if Trimby at the time would have been considered an equal or slightly better player. And then I think the other player that I'm, like, just majorly disappointed in is Wunder, who had a horrible year, and that's something I certainly couldn't have predicted, even when he was filling in for Fnatic at the end of last year for Oscar Rinnan when he had his injury in the season finals. He was awesome in that small stretch. It looked like prime Wunder again, and so to bring him in here, especially with players that he's played with before and players that he, you know, supposedly would know how to communicate with, you would think that he'd be able to survive, but his laning is just horrible. Like, his adaptability is super low. His team fighting is really bad. Like, there was nothing positive about Wunder across this whole year, and that's not the org's fault. That's Wunder's fault for falling off. Like, Yankos was really good in spring, was my MVP pick in spring, was awful in both winter and summer. So what do you do there? Zviru got gapped by Jackie's, but Jackie's has been on a tear. Zviru is a worse mid laner. Like, Flackid looked okay. There are positives to Team Heretics, but I'm blaming more of this result, I guess, on just the results of the team rather than the process behind building the team in the first place. I'm not mad at this org for trying to put together a pseudo super team with what was offered to them. It just didn't end up working out, and for that, unfortunately, their season is over. And then for GIANTX, their season is very much still alive, and in fact, they are very much the favorites to end up getting that number 6 spot in the season finals. We'll talk about it a bit. You know, of course, the other two teams on the other side of the bracket are still very much in the race. Mad Lions is locked in, of course, and obviously the top 4 are all locked in, but that one spot's going to be contested over GIANTX and K-Corp. K-Corp is very unlikely to get that spot regardless of how well they do, as we'll talk about a bit more later, just because they would need to get top 2 in order to even have a chance to pass GX in terms of championship points. But for now, like, GX is sitting really pretty. This is a team that nobody really had expectations for, me included, and they are very likely going to be a team that at the very least gets in the tournament to play for a shot at Worlds. And then moving on to our second of the lower bracket round number 1 series. Closing out round 1 is the rivalry matchup of the weekend. Man, we were lucky to get to see this in a best of 3. It's K-Corp taking on Mad Lions Koi. And K-Corp is going to keep their season alive with a 2-0 domination here of MDK, where it just really wasn't all that close. I'm not going to spoil anything too heavily, but I am going to offer a bit of a spoiler here. This was really the only series this weekend that was a blowout, that wasn't close in some way, shape, or form, that didn't have some interesting features in it. This was just K-Corp being better than Mad Lions in basically every area. Now, that's not the biggest surprise in the world. K-Corp has straight up just been better than MDK over the course of this split, but still, for K-Corp to be in this spot in the first place, to be the 5th seed, and to have a shot, technically still be alive in terms of the season finals, it's pretty massive for them overall. We've talked at length about how basically impossible it is for them to make the season finals, and how it would be a monumental effort for them to even have a chance to get into that tournament, but they're doing everything they can right now. For MDK, this is an unfortunate place for their split to end, but it's not the end of their year. They have already qualified for season finals because they got top 2 in winter, and especially with the top of the LEC kind of being a big cluster over the course of this year, being, you know, G2 and, you know, BDS and Fnatic and the same teams kind of taking the upper echelon spots. It means that if you did finish in the upper sphere, at least one split, that's probably enough to get you into the top 6, and that was the case for Mad Lions. Even if they did struggle a bit down the stretch, they have a lot of things they need to fix, but this team still has the upside they had earlier in the year. It's just not really there right now, and we'll talk about that. But for K-Corp, player of the series is very obviously going to go to Upset. This was maybe his best series in like 3 years. Like, this was dominant from Upset. He just completely controlled the pacing of every single game that they played. They wanted to play around him, they wanted to play through him on this Kai'Sa, and they just allowed him to go to work in the mid game and in the late game, taking over these fights and quite frankly just dominating Mad Lions. There's been a lot of talk about whether or not Upset and Targamas as a bot lane duo are good enough to be justified in one of these top 5 spots. Vladi's been very good for this team, and you know, there's been some question marks elsewhere, but this is the best major series that these two have played together. Like, full stop, it's not even really all that close. Targamas was also really good in this series. Certainly the better support out of these two, which is a very interesting thing to say, but the bot lane being the one to step up and really dominate is massive for K-Corp overall. Vladi was also excellent in this series. He has just really impressed me. He has been awesome across this whole split. I never expected him to come in and be as good as he has been, but he's been a borderline top 4, top 5 mid laner, like, no questions over the course of this split. And I'm really happy to say that. There have been a lot of underperformances in that role, and, you know, generally he's a lot closer to being an upper half mid laner, you know, day one. Hopefully that's something that he's able to maintain. We've seen players come in, look really good at the start, and then fade out over time. Hopefully that's not the case for Vladi, who looks great right now. And then Kana and Closer were both really good. Closer in particular, I thought, had a very good series on some enablers. That's something that he has played a lot in recent weeks. It's not what he's most known for in terms of his champion pool, especially going back to his North America days, but it has been what he has settled into in terms of a role for K-Corp, trying to set up Vladi, trying to set up Upset, and then Kana was generally fine, definitely the better top laner on the top side. He has certainly had his own struggles, but this is a big win for K-Corp again. You gotta hope and pray that this is the start of some miraculous run, because it's very likely that summer playoffs will be the last time they play in 2024, regardless of how well they do, but there is still that small chance that they can end up making a pretty miraculous run. That's got to keep going, though, even after this series. And then for Mad Lions, this is where summer ends, but they are locked in, like I said, to season finals, and so you know, you're frustrated by this result, but at the very least, it's not the end of your year. You could give dud of the series to anybody on this team. I considered Supa and Alvaro very heavily. I considered Elyoya very heavily, but I'm going to give it to Mirwin, which might not make a ton of sense when you look at the KDAs of this series, but man, when you watch the gameplay, it's just brutal to watch Mirwin try to play out any of these matchups because truly, he has no other gear. He only has a go button, and, you know, I've always been out on Mirwin as a player. I was a little bit interested in him coming into the year because of all the hype surrounding him from a lot of people that I respect. Like, a lot of people in the industry were talking about how mechanically talented and, you know, how fought over this guy was. He ended up settling on Mad Lions, but he was the number one option for Team Heretics to bring in as a top laner, and so there were a lot of teams that wanted Mirwin and really wanted to invest into him as a player, and obviously he has this awesome playoff run in the winter split. They go on to finals, etc., but even during that playoff run, man, when he was taken out of his comfort zone, when he had to do anything that wasn't play Varus or Twisted Fate or one of these crazy picks on the top side, he just wasn't a good player. I was always really low on him, even during that miraculous playoff run in winter. That I feel like that take has aged really well because he has been awful since then. He was awful in spring, he was awful in summer, and he was awful in this series. He just isn't a good top laner in his current state. He's what people think Adam is. That's the way I've been describing him, is what people online talk about Adam being, this like feast or famine top laner that can only play 3 or 4 champions. Like, that's not who Adam is. Adam's a lot more versatile and a lot more consistent than that, but that is who Mirwin is. Like, that is the general idea of him, and so I generally just think that people are coming back down to reality in terms of their perceptions on him rather than him getting worse individually as a player, but it doesn't help that the rest of this team lost. Supa and Alvaro were awful in this series. I am going to defend them as I've done for a little while, not in terms of the gameplay that we saw here because they were awful in this series, but they are the reason Mad Lions is in the playoffs at all, because Supa and Alvaro were really the only players that were winning games for this team in the regular season. They would have clearly been bottom 2 without these two because everybody else on this team was super underperforming. Elyoya was miserable here. You know, he's a player that has typically stepped up when it's mattered the most, but this was not a good example of that. Frescowie was really the only player that I didn't think was completely outmatched, but he was awful in the regular season. So, I don't know. Obviously, Mad Lions isn't feeling particularly good right now, and I'm not feeling good about Mad Lions. They're going into season finals with negative momentum, and that's really not a great place to be. This is almost certainly not a Worlds team, but at least they'll have the opportunity to get their shit together. And then for K-Corp, you know, their playoff run continues, but like I said, they're going to need a miracle run in order to keep their season alive after this playoffs, and so that's got to start in the next series, and it doesn't get easier from here. But now that we've wrapped up round number 1, typically speaking, we would go day by day, and that means getting into the winners finals, but I'm going to save that for the end of the video. We're going to go over all 5 of those games alone at the end, but we're going to stay with our best of 3s now. So that means jumping into our round number 2 lower bracket best of 3s, and that means by the end of this, we're going to find out the other teams that have qualified for the top 4 that are going to be playing in that 3rd, 4th place matchup. And we kick it off with a matchup between the number 2 seeded BDS and the number 7 seeded GIANTX. And BDS is just barely going to pick up a win. Somehow, some way, they almost threw this series. This should have been relatively unlosable for them in a, like, on-paper matchup because they are just better across the board in basically every role that isn't mid lane. Like, there is no reason this should have ever been close in any way, shape, or form. Luckily for them, Ice was there to be able to save this series and to be able to push them into the top 4. BDS has already been qualified for the season finals. They don't really need to win any of these series, but it certainly doesn't hurt to try and get some confidence and to show that you can win some games going into what is likely the biggest tournament of the year for you. So, you know, it's nice to see them win, but it's actually the same circumstance in which I had them with Mad Lions. That first round series in the upper bracket, I had a player of the series and a dud of the series on BDS on the same team, and it's actually the same 2 players in this one, and I'm going to talk about that trend now. Ice is going to get player of the series. Man, he's freaking good. Like, he is a really talented AD carry. He does remind me a bit of, like, what Noah was last year for Fnatic. I think they're a little bit of a different style, though. Ice is one of the most clearly defined players in the LEC, at least in terms of the style that he individually offers as a player, because he's really not a good early game player. His laning is honestly quite bad, and I say that in, like, the context of where this team wants to be. Like, his laning is bad in comparison to either the best AD carries in this region or more, you know, relatively the AD carries that are expecting to try to go to Worlds. Like, he is not a laner that can really hold up in the 2v2, but his team fighting is so exceptional. Like, he is so good in front to back 5v5s in the back half of the game that it almost doesn't matter. It almost, like, is completely irrelevant whether he is ahead or behind in the back half of the game. I think this this team does a really good job of making sure he's in a good place and feeling comfortable to try and play those late game team fights, but it's just very funny because I really don't think there is a more defined AD carry in terms of their style and like what they're good and bad at in the LEC. Like, he is very clearly the late game hyper carry player, and that works for BDS, who is really good at extending games, regardless of whether or not you think this is a good team, which I definitely think is a debate right now that deserves to be had. They're really good at making sure that games don't end in 25 minutes. I think that that is something that BDS really succeeds on, and Ice is really good after 25 minutes, and so you feel good about that. He was awesome. He basically saved this entire series on the Zeri in game number 3. But I do also want to talk about Nuke. I know it kind of feels like a 1v9 for a lot of this series, but Nuke was also really good in the back half of game number 3 on the Tristana. I think his efforts are being a little bit underpraised right now. He's not been great over the course of this entire year. We just talked about how he gets blasted by Caps every single time those two go head-to-head. That was very notable in the G2 best of 3, but he's really good in a lot of other circumstances. Jackie's was awesome in this series. What a shock. That's kind of just generally what he has been. But Nuke, I think, held his own, at least in terms of generating pressure, and was arguably more effective in the back half of that third and final game. It was those two, I would say, versus the world. It was a 2v8 rather than a 1v9, I guess is the narrative that I want to pitch. But the rest of this team, like, what the hell was going on? Adam is yet again going to get a dud of the series in a winning effort. This is the second time that that has happened for BDS in this playoff run. You know, he was active. That's certainly not something that I'm going to, you know, take against him, I guess I'll say. It's not a negative that he was out there and, like, trying to make plays. Unfortunately, those plays weren't always good plays to try and make. I don't really know what's going on with Adam. Quite frankly, he looked a bit tilted in this series, and if that's going to be the case, that is a problem. He's already been subbed out once during a playoff run for this team over the course of this year. Hopefully they don't have to do that twice, because it just didn't feel like his head was in the game. I think these big moments are just a little bit too big for a player like him, which is really frustrating considering how good he is in these low pressure moments. But Sheo is somebody who I think is already incredibly overrated, and I think he had another bad series here. Not going to go on a big tangent about that because I've talked about it a lot on this channel already. I just don't think Sheo is that good of a jungler, and I think he continues to prove that. Labrov is a player that I have a lot of faith and trust in, but he really didn't do anything in this series. I think his scoreline looks worse than maybe his contributions were because, again, he was playing Maokai in game number 3 and, you know, Rakan and things like that are going to die first in a lot of these situations, but he wasn't, you know, creating these massive plays for Ice to be able to capitalize on. He just mostly was dying for the cause, which is never really an ideal place to be sitting as a primary playmaker for your team. So credit to Ice. This guy is playing awesome. It's the best split of his career by a large margin. He was never this good in winter or spring of this year for BDS. He was good. He was more the consistent guy that you kind of knew what you were going to get. This has really been kind of a game takeover type of split, and I think this meta fits him better than it ever has before. So, you know, good for BDS that they have someone like that, and for GX, unfortunately, that was the difference between them going on and them dropping out here. They still are in a really good spot to get that final spot in the season finals, as I've said before, but Jackie's is just crazy. This guy is legit cracked, and there's really not a lot of negatives that I can say about him. If he were on BDS or if he were on, you know, like SK Gaming, I think that they would be one of the best teams in the LEC. It's just not the case, and, you know, GX has a really nice find here. Hopefully they can hold on to him in terms of their roster construction. The rest of this team honestly didn't play all that bad. Patrick and Ignar were generally fine. I think they took advantage of some of Labrov's mistakes, some of Sheo's mistakes over the course of this series. Juhan, I think, did a good job as the setup man to try and make things a little bit easier for GX. I think the Nidalee really worked, which I'm shocked by in game 2 because his Nidalee has never been particularly good, but Antonio, definitely some questionable decisions. He really was not good in this playoff run for GX, which I think is definitely a bit of a concern. He was very impressive, at least to me, in terms of his regular season performances. He's not a great laner, but he is a great team fighter, and I think that's more valuable coming out of the top lane role, and that just wasn't the case here. He was making major mistakes in team fights in a lot of these best of 3s, and so we'll see if that ends up becoming a recurring problem for him as we move later on, but this theoretically could be the last split of the year for GX. It would take, like I said, a monumental effort from K-Corp getting to the finals, beating either G2 or Fnatic in order to make that happen. GX is likely going to get another shot to get themselves a qualification, you know, world spot, but unfortunately, they're not going to be able to do that here. They're not going to be able to lock it in terms of the summer playoffs. But for BDS, somehow, some way, amongst all of the problems, they've made their way into the top 4, and this is just kind of what this team does. They get top 4 every single split. The consistency is really high, even if the consistency of the individual players is rather low. I don't feel particularly great about this team at the current moment, and I'm really not sure they are going to beat either of the teams on the other side of this bracket, but at least for now, BDS has gotten themselves into the best of 5 stage. And then moving on to our second of the lower bracket round number 2 series, and this one was definitely more interesting for me. I was really excited to see where this series headed, and it did not disappoint. It was a matchup between the number 1 seeded SK Gaming and the number 5 seeded K-Corp, and K-Corp picks up yet another massive victory here, 2-1. They're gonna be moving on to the top 4, and they are going to continue the journey of going 10th, top 4. So we'll see where this ends up going. I've seen some weird discussion online about K-Corp's like standings and placement. I've seen some people say they only need to win 1 more series to get into season finals. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know how that's the case. Like looking at the championship points table, winning this next series would get them 120 championship points. They need 130 championship points in order to get into the top 6 to pass GIANTX at the very least in the top 6, and that doesn't seem like that would happen if they got 3rd place. To me, it seems like they need the 150 that they would get from getting 2nd place. But if I somehow have this wrong, which I don't think I do, if Leaguepedia somehow has this wrong, let me know, because this seems to be the kind of story is that K-Corp doesn't just need to win their 4th place matchup, they need to win their 3rd place matchup as well. They need to get into the top 2 in order to qualify for the season finals, but they're still alive. They still have a chance of being able to do that, and the fact that this team is where they are right now, the perseverance that this org has shown after really struggling at the beginning of the year, it's a really big testament to the players on this team, especially the players that have been around this whole time. For Upset and Targamas, who have been 10th, and now, are going to be top 4, it's a really nice finish for them, especially for Upset, who I think has been, kind of cursed for a little while, regardless of his individual performances. So we'll talk about it. Player of the series was honestly kind of difficult because, as disappointing as this is for SK Gaming, and trust me, we will get into that, this is a major letdown from the number 1 seed in the regular season, a team that I think I clearly had as a Worlds team going into the playoffs that I'm certainly questioning and rethinking that thought process now. It's a major letdown that they lost, but they kind of individually played pretty well. Like, there were some good performances coming in from SK. There were good performances from K-Corp. I think generally this was just kind of a high execution series. There weren't a ton of like ridiculous errors until the end, and K-Corp kind of came out on top in that, and the one that really kind of made the most of the minutes, I would say, made the most of those big plays was Kana in the top lane, who is going to get player of the series. I think Broadcast gave it to him as well. He was the one making the high profile moves at the end of the game. His Jace was electric, like truly incredible. A Korean Jace coming in, like, yeah, it's going to look like this. So definitely interesting to see if that's something they continue to move more towards in the future, but I definitely considered other K-Corp players for this player of the series, most notably Vladi in the mid lane, who was terrific once again. This guy is just really good, like genuinely a top 4, top 5 mid laner right now. I think you can put him right there at number 4 if you really wanted to. I think that that's a generally pretty easy place to put him in terms of the performances he's offered, and that's crazy for somebody who is in his rookie split, let alone his rookie year in the LEC for a team that had been finishing in 10th. So for him to be the best and most consistent player on the roster right now, that is a really big thing. The solo lanes were great here. Bot lane continues to look really good in this playoff run. Rahel and Luan are the best bot lane in the LEC, and I think they honestly kind of proved that a bit in this series where they continued to play really well, but it just wasn't enough. Upset and Targamas actually kind of went blow for blow with them. I do think they were slightly worse than Rahel and Luan on the other side, just individually, but they were just as good in terms of the overall impact they had on the game. Closer continues to look good on Maokai duty and Sejuani duty, which he's basically been forced on for the past 4 weeks in a row, but K-Corp has found their style. They found the way that they want to play the game, and honestly, I think this meta fits them really well, especially if they're going to go for more aggressive picks like the Jace in the top lane. They could be a really dangerous team to end up facing, and, we'll talk about it once we get to the bracket preview at the end of the video. There is a very, very real chance that they are a top 3 team in the LEC in terms of their results in the summer split, but unfortunately, who knows if that will be enough. And then for SK Gaming on the other side, again, this is a majorly disappointing result. There is no other way to look at this. The fact that you lost this series is basically awful. Like, there is no explanation. You can't just chalk this one up to natural variance. I don't even think you played all that bad, and yet you still weren't able to walk out with a win, and that is horrible. Dud of the series is pretty obviously for me going to go to Niski in the mid lane. He made some really great plays over the course of this series, but at the end of the day, when both teams are playing relatively well, when they both have advantages, if you make a major mistake at the end of the game, that's it. Like, dunzo, done, dusted. That's it. That's the full conversation, and that's unfortunately what Niski did. Threw it away with a horrible arcane shift in that 3rd and final game, and then, of course, was also not really good on the Ezreal in terms of doing damage in these fights either. Just a really bad closeout game from Niski, and he's proven the haters right at the moment, which is a really sad thing to say. It's unfortunate because, like I said, I do think he was pretty good in a lot of the rest of this series, but that all comes crumbling down if you were bad in game number 3. Rahel and Luan were pretty solid. Irrelevant was really aggressive, was often willing to trade 1v1, with a lot of other people on the other side of this matchup. For the most part, that was a negative, but at times it was a positive. Isma, I think, generally wasn't the problem here. His engages were actually pretty solid, and I thought his timers were really good, but it just wasn't enough, and I think that's the most concerning thing for SK Gaming, is that I do think they played relatively well, and while they did make a couple of errors, like, you would imagine that a couple of errors plus, good play from the other, members of the team would be enough to be able to win a series against a team like Corp, but that wasn't the case. Maybe they're just not as good as we thought they were, and unfortunately, that seems to be the reality. Of course, they're locked into the season finals as well. They don't have to worry about that, but Corp absolutely does. Their run still has to go basically perfect from here on out. They have to still beat one of the two best teams in the league in order to get into that season finals, at least as far as I'm aware with how this goes. And unfortunately, if that doesn't happen for Corp, a lot of this is just going to be a fun little memory for fans going into 2025. But now with our best of threes wrapped up, it's time to get into our first best of 5 here in the summer split. Winners finals is upon us. I'm really excited to talk about it. It's the two best teams in the LEC fighting it out to see which one of them will already confirm their spot in the finals of the summer split. Of course, both are basically playing for bragging rights at this point. Both teams have a ton of championship points, and so neither of them needs to win this in order to get into the season finals, in order to get to Worlds, but a trophy is still a trophy. Winning the domestic league is massive for a lot of these teams, and I think they're going to view it as such. It is, like I said, the two best teams in the LEC going head-to-head, at least at the moment. It's the number 3 seeded G2 Esports taking on the number 4 seeded Fnatic, and the legendary LEC matchup. I mean, these are the two best teams, the teams that represented the LEC at MSI this past, couple months, and have been the two best teams at the top of the standings. Of course, there were, some ups and downs for G2. They went 1-2 in week number 1, then they did not lose another game the rest of the split. Fnatic was dominating at the beginning. They were the team to go undefeated the longest, but couldn't quite hold that momentum into the back half of the regular season, but both have looked really good in their limited time so far in the playoffs, both getting by, at least relatively okay competition in SK Gaming and BDS, respectively, to get to this spot in best of threes, and I think both have some clear upsides and downsides. Of course, G2 is going to be the favorite in a series like this, if only because they've just beaten Fnatic so many times in these best of 5s over the past few years. It's definitely going to be an uphill climb, and I definitely don't think that is, wrong to think. I think G2 is the best team in the LEC until proven otherwise, and this could be a chance for Fnatic to prove otherwise, but when you look at these matchups, it's always, in my opinion, really going to come down to the mid lane matchup between these two teams. I hate to really, whittle this down into one lane, but Caps versus Humanoid is such a massive conversation and such a massive turning point for both of these teams. If Caps is just able to come out and dominate in the way that he has other mid laners throughout the rest of this year, it's not going to be a particularly close series with how much Fnatic relies on Humanoid, but if Humanoid can step up and play like he does when these games matter a lot, if he can be locked in and, playing at the top of his level, which we know is incredibly solid, then these two are going to be a lot more evenly matched, and that really opens the door for the rest of Fnatic to really show some of their strengths. For Razork, who's been awesome, to potentially be the better jungler. For Noah and Jun to potentially be the better bot lane. It's all up to whether or not Humanoid can survive in that mid lane matchup and at least go even with someone like Caps. And so, it's definitely an exciting matchup. G2 are my favorites. They're the ones that I'm going to project to win this series, if only just because no one's really been able to take down G2 in the LEC over the course of this year. But, Fnatic is playing strong right now, and hopefully some of the momentum they were able to get earlier on in the year can carry over. But is that going to be the case, or is G2 just going to shut that down and prove once and for all that they are the team in Europe, the team in the LEC? Well, of course, going game by game means we have to start with game number 1, and the winner of game number 1 was G2 Esports. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is not a surprising outcome. They quite frankly just dominated the first game of this series. The only thing that is shocking about this is that G2 historically has actually not been all that good in game 1s. They are really good throughout the rest of the series, but typically speaking, they'll, take game 1 off. They've done it in both of the finals already, regardless of who they're playing into, either Fnatic or Mad Lions. They've lost game 1 and then been able to come back and win the series 3-1. They are just going to dominate this first game, though. They're going to cut out the middleman, if you will, simplify the process. This was not a close game. This was a demolition. Nobody was really, on for Fnatic. Nobody looked good in game number 1, and everybody looked good for G2. Player of the game was honestly kind of difficult for me because everybody did such a good job. I'm going to give it to Caps in the mid lane. I think there are definitely some arguments for someone like Broken Blade, who I very much considered for this, but I'm going to give it to Caps mostly for the team fighting aspect. His ability to deal damage on the Ezreal was top notch, and especially with this AD carry mid meta that we are like firmly in the middle of right now, when you have someone like Caps that you can trust so much to pilot those champions at a really high level, it just increases the floor and the ceiling really of your team to astronomical heights, and Caps is ridiculous. I understand that people were like, oh, well, the laning phase was even. If that's the best thing you got, then that's not great for Fnatic at the current moment. So really nice game from Caps, really nice win for G2. Broken Blade, like I said, was also excellent. We'll get to Oscar Rinnin in just a second, but really capitalizing on some really poor decisions by Oscar, and Broken Blade really capitalizing in terms of being able to call the brand or call Ezreal up to the top side and really take advantage of some mistakes made by the Renekton on the other side. That's something that Broken Blade does at a really high level, is capitalize on the enemy's mistakes, and trust me, Oscar makes a lot of those. Hans and Mickey were generally fine as well. On the bot side, they didn't really have to do all that much. It's good setup to have Leona plus MF. It's really consistent damage, both early and late. One of the reasons that I really like things like MF, and, you know, we'll talk about it, things like Jhin and Ashe and Ezreal. I think these are the best AD carries in the game right now, and one of the reasons for that is just anything that in the bot lane right now that you can get that is self-sustaining, that doesn't need a lot of resources, that can just generally do their own thing. That's a huge advantage because it allows you to invest into your AD carry in the mid lane, likely, or your carry in the mid lane, and then your jungler who wants a lot of resources in the current meta. So, you know, having something like MF that will win lane 2v2 basically on her own, and then also just have the ultimate in team fights, it's really good. Overall, G2 just played well. I think they had a good draft, and I think they executed on it great, so really in favor of them. For Fnatic, I think some of the criticism thrown towards this team is unjustified about this game. I tweeted this out basically right before recording this segment, but it's really funny to me how the LoL community can be so infatuated with picks like Ashe and picks like Ezreal, and then sit there and be like, Jhin is such a useless, worthless champion. I just don't understand it. Jhin is one of the best AD carries in the game right now, and I certainly do not fault Fnatic for picking it here. Jhin was far from the problem. Again, going back to what is strong in the bot lane right now, AD carries that don't need resources, that can be generally self-sustaining, that are going to be okay in the 2v2 and very valuable in the back half of games. Maybe Jhin isn't a hyper carry, and I get that Unga Bunga, you know, League fans can sometimes be like damage number equal champion good, but Jhin does so much more than that, and especially in a meta where jungle and mid are mostly the carry roles at the moment, like having something like Jhin to be able to enable a Zyra or a Lucian or, you know, an Ezreal or a Brand or something like that, it's much more valuable than people are giving it credit for. So I don't think Jhin or this draft at all is the problem. In fact, I think this is a pretty good draft, all things considered, from Fnatic. I think the gameplay was the problem. Anybody really could get dud of the game here. I considered Razork, and we'll talk about that in a second, but I'm going to give it to Oscar Rinnin. He was really not good in this game, number one, and I think he just continues to have the same issues that he's had his entire career. Really, the only thing that's improved about him is his good games. His bad games have stayed just as bad as they were at the beginning of his career because, man, he is just so aggressive. He will always take trades when you take these, like, aggressive lane matchups like Renekton versus Jace. He's going to take these trades early on, and if he loses the trades, he's doomed. He's just going to get dove over and over again. That's what happened in this game. He just doesn't really seem to have that switch in his brain that tells him when or when not to fight. He's always going to fight, and that's been a negative for him overall. He's going to get dead of the game for it, but Razork was also really poor here. I think his job was really hard because he had 3 losing lanes, and so there really wasn't a lot he could do, but he was also very useless on what I would consider to be maybe the best champ in the game right now outside of Brand in Zyra. Humanoid was whatever on the Lucian in the mid lane. He wasn't the problem. Noah and Jun certainly weren't the problem on the bot side. It was the top side of the map that I think really let Fnatic down and really opened the door for G2 to snowball it, but this game wasn't close. It's not like there were just a couple of things that went wrong for Fnatic. Everything kind of went wrong, and G2 just did everything right. If they do this again, this isn't going to be a close series, but Fnatic needs to bounce back. They can't go down 0-2 to a team like G2. Are they going to be able to do that in the second game, or is G2 going to take a commanding 2-0 series lead? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and this is what we were looking for, a really nice bounce back from Fnatic to at least show that they can compete in a series like this. And we talked about it kind of in the preamble here. If Fnatic is going to have a shot at being able to take down G2, they need Humanoid. He is the guy that needs to step up and really be a focal point for this team. Caps played pretty well on the other side of this matchup, but Humanoid was better, and that's going to be such an important thing for this team moving forward. forward. He's going to get player of the game. This was a super easy decision for me. This was an elite Azir performance, and I know there's going to be some conversations about whether or not it's wrong to take Humanoid off of carries and to put him on facilitative things. I want to remind people he is still very good on facilitators, and this team still functions really well when he's on facilitators. You can play through Razork, you can play through Noah. This isn't, a one type of comp team. They're not limited in that front where you can put Humanoid on Talia and put Razork on a Brand or Noah on a hyper carry and play for that. You can still win in that direction, but I think simplifying the process, getting back to basics, putting Razork on something that is literally designed to run through the middle of the map and just try to win through that is really smart, especially for a team that does value a bit more of the macro sense. And so, really like the idea for Fnatic in this draft, and I think they executed on it great. Humanoid's a really good player when he wants to be, and clearly this series is a big enough one for him to lock in and actually try. So happy with his performance. I thought Noah and Jun were excellent. Jun in particular was awesome on the Bard. His name really hasn't come up a ton over the course of the summer split, which I think is a little bit curious because he was so good at the end of spring and so good in the playoffs of spring and at MSI, and he's been very good. Like, I'm not trying to take anything away. There were stretches where Jun was awesome over the course of the summer split. He's just been hidden a bit more behind players like Noah and Razork that I think have taken more of the spotlight, but Jun is arguably the backbone of this team, and you put him on a really aggressive playmaker that can move around the map and be really, frisky like the Bard, and I think all of a sudden you start to remember just how good he has been as a player. He's been better than Mickey, for sure, on the other side of this matchup. Noah continues to look solid. He gets his signature champ in the Ezreal. It's one of them. That and the Aphelios are definitely the two that I think about when I think of Noah. He looks good on it. And then Razork's really the other player that you have to shout out. Sejuani and Maokai, they've become the staples, as I've talked about a lot on this channel. People were talking about how AP junglers, these scaling junglers, were never going to fall out of meta, and that it's crazy if anybody ever tries to move into a different direction with, the champions in the jungle. But just remember, this same thing happens every single year. We get some aggressive picks in the jungle meta in the regular season, and as things get a little bit tenser, as we continue on in the year, teams start to value the consistency that things like Sejuani and Maokai offer, even if they really haven't changed all that much, which they haven't. And the best champions in the meta still haven't changed really all that much either. And so the consistency of Sejuani continuing to rise, and Razork is a very good facilitator at this point in his career. Overall, Fnatic looked really good, and I think it was a pretty complete performance. And for G2, I just think they overcooked a bit in the draft. I know marksmen are really good, but maybe 3 is a little bit too much. I understand that you just want to get as much damage on the Rift as possible, but the Varus top in particular did not work. Broken Blade, very easy choice for dead of the game. That pick got really brutalized in the back half. He just had no mobility, no safety, no ability to peel off for himself, and really wasn't doing any damage either. Broken Blade was essentially not in this game. This was kind of a 4v5 for a majority of it because the Varus was essentially useless on R5. And so, I think it just was cooking a bit too much in terms of the draft, even if I do think in certain circumstances this could work. I actually think tanks and damage dealers on the top side are in a really good spot right now. I think things like Cassante and Ornn, if you want like a frontliner, or things like Camille or Jace, as we saw earlier this week, or Rumble can be really aggressive, as top lane picks. There are just so many things that are valuable. I don't think wasting that role on something like a Varus that isn't really confirmed at all to be useful in the game isn't going to be, that's not a good draft strategy, in my opinion. Also, of course, Yike not looking good. It's hard to play Maokai when you have a couple of losing lanes, especially when topside completely falls apart. I still think Mickey is really not playing all that well right now. He's had a really rough 2024. I think he's playing better than he was in spring and in winter, but the bar is kind of in hell in terms of those performances. Hans and Caps were generally still there. Caps, in particular, just knows how to deal damage in a lot of these fights, even when his team is super behind in gold. But Fnatic was better, and we've got a series on our hands. We're tied up at 1 apiece. We essentially move into a best of 3 now between these two teams. Winning game number 3 becomes paramount. Getting yourself into a positive position in this series is ridiculously important, and it's going to be majorly important for both of these teams to establish that, we only have to win 1 of the final 2 games. And so who's going to be able to take that prize? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to go up in this series 2-1, and they have taken full control. What a banger. A 50-minute classic here from G2 and Fnatic. This is everything we could have wanted this series to be, and then some. It has really been that fun for these two teams, and this was a blast of a game. It really was Caps attempting to 1v9 a really strengthened, solidified Fnatic core. He just couldn't quite do it on the Ezreal. I think perhaps in some other circumstances, this could have been winnable for G2 and for Caps if he had been able to really get going on maybe a different champion, but going up against Fnatic as a whole with the comp that essentially they just won with in game number 2, it was going to be a pretty difficult ask, and now Fnatic is one game away from not only making finals, that's obviously great, but more importantly, in my opinion, from taking down G2 in a best of 5, which is something that this team has just not been able to do in quite a long time. The confidence boost that would give would be ginormous, but the job is not done yet. Let's talk about game 3, and then we will get into some more talk about the series. Player of the game was honestly kind of hard. I'm going to give it to Razork, mostly for consistency here. He was awesome on the Sejuani, the setups that he was able to create, the pathing in the late game. Perfect stuff. I mean, genuinely, like, could you ask the top side of Fnatic to have been better this game? Oscar, Razork, Humanoid were all fantastic, and Humanoid had some errors in terms of getting caught out and kind of being the target for what G2 wanted to do to get resources. Caps was excellent, like I said in this game, but Razork, Oscar, like, essentially played perfect games. This was a 50-minute game where your Ornn and your Sejuani combined for 1 death. Like, that is unheard of. It truly was an exceptional performance from both of them, who both really needed to step up. They were both infinitely better than their opposition on the other side. I think a lot of people are going to give credit to Noah, and he deserves it. He was awesome for the most part in this game. He kind of had a bit of a leave moments. That's kind of what I'm going to start calling it for those LPL fans out there. Leave, of course, the AD carry for Edward Gaming. He has these moments where he's great for most of the game and just randomly makes 1 or 2 like game-losing errors. For LEC fans, maybe someone like Bo would ring a bit more true, where for most of the game he's so good and then he'll just make 1 back-breaking mistake and just crush the dreams of his own team. Noah can sometimes be like that, but for the most part, it didn't end up costing them in this game. The Caitlyn, when it did end up showing up, was incredible. Like, he was doing a ridiculous amount of damage. I also want to reiterate this point that I see kind of mistranslated a lot online. Caitlyn is not an early game champion. She is an early game champion. Like, she does well in the early game. She's a lane bully. Her range gives her options that other champions just don't have, and I do think it's also fair to talk about how she gets weaker in terms of the mid-game and, you know, the 20 to 25 minute mark. The 2-item spike for her is incredibly weak in comparison to a lot of other champions, but I think it is sometimes undersold just how much of a parabola her power strength curve actually is, because she is incredibly strong in lane because of the range, and then also when you hit 4-5 items full build, she's like one of the highest damage ADCs in the game, like full stop. Full crit Caitlyn is going to literally eviscerate you. So this notion that Caitlyn is only good in the early game, it's not something I personally agree with. I think it honestly undersells just how good she can be if these games do go 47 to 50 minutes, and that's exactly what happened here, but just a really good showing from Fnatic across the board, Razork in particular, and Oscar as well, I really want to give a shout out to, but Noah was also, of course, very good in this game. But for G2, this is a frustrating one to lose, and I think if you had had more of a team effort, this was a win. I think if you had any performance out of the top side of the map, perhaps you win this game. Broken Blade is the easiest possible choice for dead of the game that you could give. He has been horrible so far in this series, and there's really no explanation for that. This is somebody who does play best of 5s rather well. He's always been very good in the best of 5 stage, even when I didn't like him a ton as a player on things like TSM. Like, he's always been a good best of 5 player, but he was awful in games 2 and 3. Like, this was worse for sure because Caps was playing so well, and, you know, Hans was doing damage, and Yike was trying to set things up. Broken Blade was quite literally dragging the team down, but, you know, perhaps he's going to get better as the series goes along. They're certainly going to need him to, because this kind of performance is just, quite frankly, not acceptable. Mickey also with some really bad engages on the Nautilus. I think his timers are just very, very weird right now. It doesn't feel like he's in the right headspace to be one of the best supports in the league, and that's a really frustrating place to be. He just has such bad moments that it's really hard to capitalize on the good ones that he actually is able to create for himself. So G2 definitely not playing out the game that they wanted to, but at least they made it close. But now they're on the brink of elimination, or at least moving down into the lower bracket. Fnatic is on the brink of making it to the finals. That's massive for them, and beating G2 is also ginormous. G2's back's up against the wall for what feels like the first real time this year domestically. Let's see how they respond. Is Fnatic going to be able to close this out in 4 games, or is G2 going to be able to push us to a Silver Scrapes game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was G2 Esports. They are going to take game number 4. They are going to tie up the series once again, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5. We've done it. We are moving to game 5, G2 and Fnatic. This is the classic that we have been waiting for so long. It's been so long since these two teams have felt evenly matched, and this is really the first time we've gotten a series between them, at least that I can recall off the top of my head, that has felt this back and forth, where it genuinely feels like either team can win it at any moment. It really does feel like that that right now, and that's a really fun thing to say, but unfortunately for Fnatic, I don't think their draft strategy at the end of this was all that secure. They end up drafting R5 Renekton. Now, I think Renekton generally is really good as a champion. I think he's in a really good state, but maybe not Renekton into Varus, Corki, MF. That's a very weird choice in my opinion. I don't think Renekton fits this game at all, and I think, unfortunately for Fnatic, they ended up paying the price for that. I don't think it was just that. There were some macro errors, and I generally think some players are getting overvalued as well in terms of this performance, but you know, I just complained about him. Let's talk about him. Player of the game is going to go to Broken Blade. He was really bad in Game 3, like truly atrocious. Couldn't play anything in the late game on the Renekton. Completely fell behind and then offered nothing to the game overall. And then here he is on Varus, a pick that he really struggled on in game number 2 as well, where it felt like they were just cooking a bit too much, and he dominates in this game. Now, I think part of that is picking Renekton, right? Varus is going to do much better in that matchup than he is, you know, in a lot of other matchups, into things like Ornn that you would typically see on the other side of that matchup, but Broken Blade did a great job of capitalizing on that matchup, and that's really what you need to see. I mean, the team in general did a great job of capitalizing on that matchup, but the Varus got very far ahead, and they were just able to snowball that out of control. Sejuani continues to look basically unbeatable at this level. I hate to tell everybody I told you so, but man, I went on a crusade at the beginning of the year saying that Sej was still the most consistent jungle in the game, and here we are. Hans looked really good on the MF. You have so much lockdown on this team that it makes a lot of sense to just go for something that can win early, punish the Kai'Sa, and then, you know, just translate relatively effortlessly into the late game. You know, Mickey was better on the Rel. I thought he had a couple of great engages, and Caps did a good job on the Corki, even if he didn't really have to do all that much in this game. G2 looked much better here in Game 4 than they did in Game 3, and in Game 2, even though, like, they were able to make both of those games kind of close. Game 3 in particular was close. G2's wins have been the most dominant in this series. Games 1 and 4 have definitely been the most clear-cut of the 4 games so far. But for Fnatic, the reason for that is when they lose, they just lose so hard. And it goes back to Oscar Rinnin just having a lot of trouble understanding what he needs to do in certain specific matchups. And I really do think that's the big problem for Oscar, is like individual matchup analysis. He clearly was not prepared to play Renekton into Varus because he was going for a lot of these aggressive trades early and then just getting poked out and losing the lane and just not being effective. He's going to get dead of the game for it. I know dead of the game has gone to the top laner in all 4 games so far. Trust me, I'm not trying to pick on top laners, but it's just kind of been the way that this series has gone. Top lane has been super influential and towards whether or not this game, you know, is easy to win or not. And unfortunately for Fnatic, it wasn't, because Oscar didn't play well. I also want to give, like, a shout-out to Noah, who was, like, bad this game. I know the scoreline doesn't look all that bad on the Kai'Sa, but not only did he accomplish nothing in lane, which is expected, he's playing Kai'Sa Leona into MF Rel, but even outside of that, like, his fighting in the back half of this game was really poor. I just don't think Noah was all that good in this one on the Kai'Sa, and I think there's real, like, negatives to point out. I think the scoreline is definitely not indicative of anything here. He was one of the weaker players in the game. Humanoid was taking a lot of 1v1s, trying to do some aggressive plays. Sometimes they were bad plays, but sometimes they were good. You know, Razork on the brand wasn't able to carry. I think if they had given him a bit more time, perhaps the team fights do go the way of Fnatic. Jun was generally fine, but again, this was a pretty easy game to talk about. It's just the Varus getting really far ahead and being able to get enabled by the Sejuani, by the Rel, even by the MF ultimate to really just blow up some fights, and it became pretty easy for G2 to win and for G2 to tie up the series with, and that's really the important part, right? Is we're sitting now at 2-2 going into the final game of the series. G2 has a little bit of momentum, but Fnatic is going back on blue side, massive advantage, and so this is a big one. The winner goes to the finals here in the summer split. The loser has to go down to the lower bracket. Who is going to take game number 5? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 5. They are going to take this series. Of course they're moving on to finals. Of course, that's awesome. Fnatic is going back-to-back in terms of making the finals. I hope that they can complete the journey because it's been a long time for them, but arguably more importantly, they alleviate the curse. They've done it. They've beaten G2 in a best of 5. This felt undoable for so many years for this Fnatic team. I can't imagine the relief for these players in this big moment to draft Nidalee B2 in a game 5, to draft Renekton B1 after everybody had been criticizing it. Jhin is a pick that people criticize. I've defended all of these champions over the course of this year. Maybe not as much Nidalee. You know, I'm pretty on par with the Nidalee discourse that if you're bad, you shouldn't play her, but Razork is anything but bad, and we definitely saw that here. Fnatic is able to get over the hump. G2, honestly, for the first time this year, suffers any sort of momentum loss at the domestic LEC level. We'll see how they end up responding to that. We've talked about it all year. They don't need to do anything here in summer. They've already won both winter and spring. If they don't compete the three-peat, then it doesn't really matter. Nothing really changes. They're going to be the number 1 seed in the season finals either way, but this is still a massive win for Fnatic just from a confidence perspective. To know that you can beat G2 in a best of 5, that you can outplay them is a massive, massive dub. Player of the game and player of the series as a whole simply has to go to Razork in the jungle, who was phenomenal. This Nidalee in game number 5 was exceptional. One of the best Nidalee games that we've seen in the LEC all year long, without question. I mean, truly an excellent performance. Apparently, coaches told him to pick the Sejuani, and he picked the Nidalee anyways. He said, no, I want Nidalee. Like, that's what I want. I want to go for that pick here. And he made it work. He very much made it work, and I'm really, really happy for him that he was able to do that. Razork was excellent throughout the series, specifically on that Sejuani. Very consistent, but the Nidalee, of course, is what's pushing him over the top. A very deserving player of the series. Humanoid was the other player that I considered for that role, because he was so consistent across all the games. There were some bad plays, but for the most part, he had bad plays in attempt to make a good play. Like, he was trying to do things, and I'll never really criticize someone for going out there and like attempting to try and further his team's position in the game, especially in losing efforts. And so I felt really good about Humanoid. He was great on the Corki. Noah was awesome on the Jhin. This is why Jhin is so good, is because he literally takes no resources, no effort in order to be relevant, so long as you are good at the champion. And that was shown here for Noah. Jhin was good this series. Oscar was much better here in game number 5. Overall, this was Fnatic's most dominant and most clear win of the entire series, and it came at the most important time. Really happy for this team. And for G2, they move down into the lower bracket now. They're going to play the winner of course, BDS and K-Corp, which is a very interesting matchup, but this is not an ideal situation for them. It could be worse. Again, they don't really have a ton to play for, but giving Fnatic that mental edge, knowing that they can beat you, it's really not a great place for them to be sitting, especially because they weren't perfect over the course of this year. I still think they're going to be just fine, but I did have to give a dud of the game. It kind of goes to everybody on the team, but I'm going to give it to Yike. I think you could give it to Broken Blade on the TF. I think you could give it to Mickey X on the Braum. Those were kind of the candidates here, but I thought Yike's pathing was really bad in this game, and quite frankly, Razork just abused him in that jungle matchup. This is the reason that if you are good at Nidalee, it is a little bit better than Sedge, and why Sedge I have considered to be the most consistent pick, and not necessarily like the highest upside pick, because if you're really good at Nidalee, and if you are the better player, Sedge can have a lot of trouble actually playing into that matchup, and that's kind of what we saw here. But overall for G2, it's really hard to look at this series and see anything other than just like a small roadblock. Like, hopefully you can get around it and get over it, but even if you only get third in this summer split, you're still going to be the number 1 seed in the season finals. You're very likely still going to go to Worlds. That is the end goal for this team, is to just get into a spot where you feel the most comfortable going into an international tournament. So we'll see what ends up happening, but I'm not going to freak out over G2. We'll see how they handle the third place, the semifinals matchup. But for Fnatic, they're heading to the finals for back-to-back splits. That's massive for them, and they just proved to us that they can do it, that they can be the LEC Summer Split champions. But it's not just about one series. You've got to win one more. So hopefully they can keep this momentum rolling. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC weekend number 2 overview and analysis video of the playoffs here in the summer split. Up on the screen, the updated playoff bracket. After today, we only have 4 teams remaining. Fnatic, of course, winning the winners finals, gets themselves into the grand finals at the end of this bracket. G2, of course, losing, moving down into the semifinals, but we still have one more series before that. And as you can see, that's BDS taking on K-Corp. They are meeting in that 3rd, 4th place matchup here. And I'm really excited for this matchup. To kind of preview it very quickly, I think BDS on paper is definitely the better team, but honestly, I expect K-Corp to win this. They are my projected winners of this series. As much as I believe in BDS, there is something going on with them right now. They clearly are not in the right headspace in terms of their consistency, and I do think that their players are just kind of out of it. Not to mention the weird yips that they've had in best of 5s. In this year so far, they've yet to be able to win a best of 5 in 2024 up until this point, and they've been in quite a few. I think it's just going to cost them. I think they will go out in 4th place here. I think K-Corp moves on to face G2. Now, unfortunately, I don't think they get by G2. Those are the 2 series that will be in the next video later on this weekend. Of course, we'll cover everything on this channel, but I would expect G2 to be able to get the job done against K-Corp probably rather handily. Maybe K-Corp wins a game, but I would expect G2 to pretty much dominate that series, and unfortunately, that means I don't expect K-Corp to make the season finals. I think it really would take a miraculous, monumental effort for them to make top 2, for them to beat G2 in a best of 5. I just think is a little bit out of their pay grade, but maybe G2's taking it off. Who knows? They have no real reason to play, so we'll have to see, but let me know if you agree or disagree disagree with me down in the comments section below. Who do you think is in the best spot right now in the LEC? Do you think Fnatic has overtaken G2 as the favorite to win the split? Or do you think that that series was a bit of an outlier for G2? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions. Do you think Corp can get the job done? Do you think BDS is better than I'm giving them credit for? Just let me know your thoughts and opinions on everybody down in the comment section below. Of course, if you like the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only post about the LEC on this channel, we post about all 4 of the major regions. That's the LCS, LEC, LCK, and the LPL. Of course, we will be covering the rest of the LEC playoffs by the end of next weekend, so I'm excited for that, and of course, the season finals are coming up, so hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when all of those videos do end up going live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all